seems to be sort of giving you a guide for how to develop an eating disorder, how to restrict your eating.
And that's just one little glimpse of what CNN was shown when one of our reporters took over a 14-year-old's TikTok account. It shows just how easily and quickly dangerous content can appear on the social media of children, teenagers, younger than teenagers. Today, a bipartisan group of U.S. senators introduced a bill that would require social media platforms to try to provide more safety mechanisms for kids and their parents. The legislation is called the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA. It would, among other things, require social media to provide minors with options to protect their information. It would give parents new controls over social media apps. It would create a duty for online platforms to prevent certain risks to minors, such as promotion of suicide or eating disorders or sexual exploitation. It would provide academic researchers with access to data for research purposes as well. The version of the bill reintroduced today has been revamped after the version introduced last year was criticized by groups such as the ACLU and other groups for potentially leading to censorship of items involving LGBTQ healthcare resources, for example. Joining me now are the two co-sponsors of this bill in the U.S. Senate, Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. Thanks to both of you for being here. I really appreciate it. Senator Blackburn, let me start with you. Last year, about 90 organizations across the political spectrum signed a letter warning about the dangers of last year's bill, last year's KOSA. They wrote KOSA would require online services to prevent a set of harms to minors, which is effectively an instruction to employ broad content filtering to limit minors' access to certain online content. At a time when books with LGBTQ themes are being banned from school libraries, KOSA would cut off another vital avenue of access to information for vulnerable youth. Obviously, not talking about sexual exploitation of children, but in terms of resources for gay kids, lesbian kids, how would this new version of the bill address that criticism, if it does?
Yes, and thank you so much, Jake, for covering the legislation. And we're so pleased to have the support of hundreds of organizations on this legislation. And we've made certain that this is focused on the process and that it is focused on how social media platforms are to perform that duty of care, have that standard, and to make certain that children and parents are going to have the ability to exercise what they need to prevent these algorithmic black boxes from pushing their children down certain routes that maybe the child does not want to go. But being certain there's transparency on those algorithms, that, as you mentioned, that duty of care that is there, those are just primary components of this legislation.
Senator Blumenthal, this new version of the bill still includes the enforcement clause that reads in part, quote, in any case in which the Attorney General of a state has reason to believe that an interest of the residents of that state has been or is threatened or adversely affected by the engagement of any person in a practice that violates this act or a regulation promulgated under this act, the state may bring a civil action on behalf of the residents of the state. I have to say, Senator, you might have a lot more faith in state attorneys generals than I do, but this really allows state attorney generals, which generally speaking are elected officials, no offense to politicians, but elected officials, and it opens up possibly an avenue of censorship or even just sloth, just widespread, well, I don't want to deal with any of this, so I'm just going to ban any of it. Aren't you worried about that? I don't have to go into the particulars of attorneys general that you might not like or that Senator Blackburn might not like, but I bet you could rattle off lists.
As a former attorney general for 20 years in Connecticut and a former federal prosecutor, U.S. attorney there, I have perhaps more faith than you do, but I'm not relying on faith in attorneys general. We, in fact, have met that criticism by narrowing the duty of care so that now it applies to very specific kinds of toxic content that are driven toward kids and that the big tech companies have a duty to reduce. And remember, Jake, that those organizations that formerly oppose, many of them now have dropped their opposition. We have 32 of our colleagues co-sponsoring it, more than double the number during the last session, reflecting that increased momentum that we see and the diminished opposition. There were some suggestions that enabled us to clarify this legislation and make it so that the burden is on big tech to be held accountable, but also more tools, more means for parents to disconnect those algorithms and for children to take back their online lives.
So, Senator Blackburn, here's an example that I think it really gets at some of the difficulty here. How will a platform such as Instagram be able to distinguish between a video that is promoting young women to develop eating disorders versus a young person talking about their experience with an eating disorder in a way that is helpful and constructive?
And what we know is the content moderators for these social media platforms are constantly working on this. And Jake, one of the things we found out as we did 5 hearings with the social media platforms, as we talked to dozens and dozens of parents, is that many times parents or children would report to a social media platform that there was something that was encouraging self-harm or something that was illegal activity, and the social media platform would do nothing. That is why our legislation actually requires a dedicated channel, a pathway for this to be reported, and a requirement for the amount of time that the social media company has to respond, so that you're able to remove some of these things. We've talked with parents who have reported some of these videos, these things that have caused death in children, and they never are responded to, or it takes weeks for the social media platform to come back, and then they say something like, well, this doesn't violate our community standard. And when we hear about the mental health crisis that is taking place in this country, the increase in suicide, 1 in 3 teenage girls having suicidal thoughts, when you read the CDC report, what you know is the actions that social media have been taking are not working. That is why we have to have this transparency, these accountabilities that are required of these platforms.
And Senator Blumenthal, there's a competing bill, as you know, that would ban kids under 13 from being able to join social media platforms. You've spoken out against it. You said it would create a national database with personal information on kids. Is there a better way, do you think, to verify kids' ages using these apps, and then maybe even have some sort of rating system in terms of what a 12-year-old is able to look at is very different than in terms of like a coherent assimilation of the information than an 18-year-old?
I welcome new ideas and allies in making kids online safer. And certainly if those ideas come forward, we would incorporate them in our bill. But remember, to do age verification, there has to be data and information submitted, private confidential data, whether it's passports or driver's licenses or some other means of data, and it goes then to a national database, or more likely as a gold mine of information to the big tech companies. They already have so much information. Kids are their product, not their customers. They sell data or monetize it in gaining more advertisers. And so we want to protect kids and also put the burden on big tech, not on parents, to be the police force here. We are in the midst of a mental health crisis, and big tech is, in effect, preying on the pain of teenagers having this repetitive, almost addictive content driven to them by the algorithms, and the default ought to be disabling the algorithms so that teens are better protected.
Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, Senator Marsha Blackburn of Tennessee, good to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dozens and